A week after the Monaco Grand Prix, Israeli F-15 and F-16 jets took off to bomb the Osirak nuclear reactor, which was under construction just north of Baghdad. Flying low to avoid detection as much as possible, the pilots conversed with each other in Saudi-accented Arabic as they skirted the Saudi-Jordanian border, telling Jordanian air traffic controllers who asked that they were Saudi Air Force, and vice versa. As it happened, King Hussein of Jordan was on holiday on his yacht in the Gulf of Aqaba and saw a flight of heavily laden F-16s with blue and white Star of David markings fly low over him and head northeast. As the Israeli Air Force had bombed Osirak the previous year, he put two and two together and sent a warning to Saddam Hussein's government, but the message never got through, and the Israeli raid went off successfully, at least in purely military terms, though one French civilian engineer was killed, along with 10 Iraqi soldiers. A French company had been building the reactor. The name Osirak was coined as it was an Osiris-class reactor that was, being sold to Iraq. But Israeli intelligence had reported, evidently incorrectly, that there shouldn't be any French engineers on site. International reaction was of general outrage, with condemnation by the International Atomic Energy Authority, the UN, and many individual governments. Even President Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, usually staunch allies of Israel, were openly critical. But Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was unrepentant, saying, "There will never be another Holocaust in the history of the Jewish people. Never again. Never again." As I record this in mid-May 2006, this obviously has some echoes of current events. Keep it civil in the comments, thank you. On the 13th of June, it was time for the annual Trooping of the Colour ceremony in London, a military parade held to honour the birthday of the monarch. Queen Elizabeth II had actually been born in April, but the weather was too dodgy around then, as well as potential clashes with Easter, so she had an official birthday in June, a tradition begun by her great-grandfather Edward VII, whose birthday was in November. As the Queen rode past the crowds, a 17-year-old boy pulled out a gun and fired 6 shots before being hauled out of the crowd by a Lance Corporal of the Scots Guards and disarmed. It turned out the gun had been a starter pistol, firing only blanks, and after a brief delay while the Queen's horse was calmed down, the ceremony proceeded. The gunman said he'd seen the assassination of John Lennon and the attempts on President Reagan and the Pope, and how famous the perpetrators of those had become, and he wanted to be famous too, and that seemed to be a good way to go about it. He became the first person since 1966 to be tried for treason, and was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, of which he served 3 before being released, changing his name and trying to put the incident behind him. While in prison, he'd written to the Queen, apologising, but never had a reply. And in a pretty impressive feat, a Dutch Christian missionary organisation named Open Doors managed to smuggle 1 million Chinese-language Bibles into China. A semi-submersible barge packed with the books in waterproof packages was towed across from Taiwan, depositing the cargo on a beach near the city of Shantou, where they were spirited away by tens of thousands of local Christian contacts who assembled for the purpose. It was a remarkable coup, and even made it into Time magazine, which wasn't entirely welcome for an organisation that relied on secrecy and anonymity for its work in smuggling Bibles and other Christian literature behind the Iron Curtain. And so to Spain, and to the Circuito de Jarama, around 30 kilometres, 20 miles or so north of Madrid. The circuit was designed by John Hugenholtz, who'd drawn up Zolder and Suzuka among others, and had been opened in 1967 when the Spanish Grand Prix was revived, and Jarama was the first venue, Jim Clark winning the non-championship test event in 1967, and Graham Hill the first championship race the following year. It alternated with the Montjuic street circuit in Barcelona until the catastrophic 1975 race when Rolf Stommelen's car somersaulted into the stands and killed a spectator, a fireman and 2 journalists, after the drivers had already threatened to strike over inadequate guardrails. Since then, Jarama had hosted every Spanish Grand Prix, but it had never been an entirely successful event. The Spanish public just didn't seem that enthusiastic about Grand Prix racing. The circuit's owners were distracted by developing the neighbouring golf course, and as the Formula One cars got bigger and wider, the track was starting to look very narrow. The date in June meant the weather was often hot and the track dusty, especially off the racing line to boot. Nonetheless, it was popular among drivers and regarded as a challenging circuit with a good variety of corners. The previous year, the Spanish Grand Prix had been a major flashpoint in the FISA-FOCA dispute, with the FISA-aligned teams, Ferrari, Renault and Alfa Romeo on that occasion, boycotting the race, which was won by Alan Jones, but subsequently declared a non-championship event. The tensions between the two organisations hadn't gone away, but they did at least seem to be trying to talk to each other these days. The last couple of races had seen problems as the number of cars wanting to enter a race had increased beyond the 30 entries permitted. To avoid further problems, a compromise had been thrashed out whereby the March and ATS teams were reduced to a single car each. That put Eliseo Salazar out of a job, but he was still well funded and Mo Nunn needed money, so Marc Surer was sent packing for the second time this season, and the Chilean took the wheel of the ensign while the Swiss driver hung around in the hopes of somebody else coming down with food poisoning or breaking a finger or something. Over at Ozella, meanwhile, Piercarlo Ginzani was replaced after 2 races with the team's sports car driver Giorgio Francia. Car number 32, Giorgio Francia. Bologna native Francia first came to notice by winning the Formula Italia series in 1972 at the age of 24, and entered both Italian and British F3 series the following year. In 1974, he entered and won the German Polyfac F3 series before being recruited by the Ozella team for Formula 2 in 1975. That first season showed some promise. He set the fastest lap of the opening round at Estoril, but ultimately he could only manage a series of lower points finishes to end up a respectable, if not stunning, joint 7th overall. After entering the first 3 races of 1976 with even less success, Ozella pulled out of F2 to concentrate on sports car racing, a series where they'd had some success in the past and was their main source of income as they built customer cars as well. Francia and Ozella finished second in the 1977 World Sports Car Championship, and later that year Bernie Eccleston offered Francia a drive in a third Brabham Alfa at Monza, but Giorgio had been out of single-seater racing for a while at that point and was way off the pace, slowest of all 34 entrants and a full 3 seconds off the next slowest driver. That seemed to kill off his F1 ambitions, but he was recruited by the Fiat Group as a test driver for Alfa Romeo and occasional race driver for Lancia. Ozella, meanwhile, had returned to F2 in 1980, and when they launched in F1 in 1981, they had initially considered bringing Francia back, but needed the funding brought by Miguel Angel Guerra. When the Argentine was injured, Enzo Ozella approached Francia again, but he was unable to get a super license on the basis that he just didn't have the single-seater results. Piercarlo Ginzani filled in for 2 races while various deals were struck, and Francia could finally take the wheel in Spain. There were moves out of the driving seat too. Harvey Postlethwaite, after having been let go by the Fittipaldi team, was snapped up by Ferrari and briefed to work on the chassis, to the consternation of the Italian motoring press, who were really not convinced that an English engineer should be given such a sought-after position. Elsewhere, the March team had brought in a young engineer named Adrian Reynard to work with Gordon Coppock on fixing their chassis, and there was another round of staff musical chairs at the ever-chaotic ATS team, as manager Joe Ramirez left to join Theodore, and former McLaren man Alistair Caldwell, who'd resigned from Brabham, was hired by Günther Schmidt as a replacement. There were a couple of visual changes too. Williams had increased investment from Mansour Odjay and had changed its official entry from Albilad Williams Racing Team to Tag Williams Racing Team. But most obviously, Lotus had renewed their association with Imperial Tobacco, and though the side pods remained in the silver, blue and red of Essex, the famous black and gold John Player special livery was back, including yellow and black uniforms for the crew. The 3-year deal was being reported for a substantial amount of money. A much-encouraged Colin Chapman had revived the idea of the Lotus 88, and Mansell had been testing it at home with a view to seeing if they could get it accepted to race at Silverstone in 2 races' time. Ozella was the latest team to debut a variable suspension system, while the others continued tinkering to make their cars work. Yet more aero tweaks for Alfa Romeo, who are hoping to join the Turbo Club at Monza this year, but certainly for next year. New skirts for the McLarens as Watson continues his search for points, and Fittipaldi had officially dropped the Avon tyres and both cars were equipped with Michelins. And indeed, 6 months of relative organisational calm after their withdrawal, Goodyear had announced they were returning to F1, starting with the next race in France. Williams and Brabham would be their first customers, and the 2 teams had never really hidden their suspicion that Michelin were favouring Ferrari and Renault, their chief customers, but were forced to work with them after Goodyear's pullout. Michelin, for their part, were annoyed because it looked very much like the title race would be between Brabham and Williams drivers, and Goodyear had just waltzed in and yanked the publicity coup out from under them. So in turn, the firm from Clermont-Ferrand announced that they would now be supplying Renault, Talbot-Ligier, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo, plus one Cosworth team, unspecified but widely supposed to be either Lotus or McLaren, as favoured clients, and the rest would just have to take standard tyres or look to Pirelli and Avon if they wanted a works deal. After all the toing and froing over the entry list, there was an unexpected arrival on Thursday in the shape of Emilio Di Viotta. The Spanish driver, who'd won the 1980 Aurora AFX British F1 Championship as Eliseo Salazar's teammate, had arrived at the circuit with his Williams FW07 chassis, registered as Equipe Banco Occidental, with number 37 applied to the nose and rear wing. Viotta had entered the Spanish Grand Prix as a one-off entrant the previous year, and thanks to his success in Britain and Banco Occidental sponsoring the race, he'd been on the front cover of the programme. But with the 30-car limit apparently set in stone, it looked like Emilio wasn't going to race, but the organisers agreed he could at least practice on Thursday. But then ATS were late arriving thanks to an air transport problem, and since Günther Schmidt seemed to have forgotten to let the Spanish Automobile Club know about it, they decided to treat the German team as a no-show, struck Slim Borgert off the entry list, and declared that they were accepting Viotta's entry. A couple of hours later, a telex arrived from FISA telling them that if they didn't want their race declared non-championship again, they would need to kick De Viotta out and reinstate Borgert, who'd just arrived with the delayed ATS team. The long tradition of local drivers having a go at their home race had been explicitly ended by the Concord Agreement, and this case seemed to confirm that they were serious about that rule at least. There was also a fiercely complicated squabble going on between the two Spanish motor clubs that I don't have time to go into here, but I'll share a link to a Facebook post with more detail by founder of the 8W website, Felix Muelas. Once actual qualifying got underway, there was the now usual round of rows over ground clearance, with this week's victims of their suspension not relaxing quick enough to beat the censors being Reutemann, Patrese, Laffite, Tombe, Mansell and Giacomelli, all of whom had to go out and try again. While after the concerns about the weight of Piquet's Brabham in Monaco, 5 cars were picked out for weighing without fuel after the end of Friday morning's practice. The minimum weight was 585 kilos. No problem for Villeneuve's Ferrari, which clocked in at a hefty 634. Laffite's Ligier was 594. Watson's McLaren 593. Jones's Williams 587. And Piquet's Brabham 580. By filling the oil and water tanks to bursting, they managed to squeak the car over the regulation weight and record a legal lap, but it looked like Laffite and the others had been right and that the Brabham was running light. Talbot were doing a big marketing push in Spain and had sponsored the race, and Jacques Laffite duly delivered, fastest on Friday and even faster as the cars blew off the dust and the track gained grip on Saturday. He celebrated his 100th Grand Prix start with his 7th pole position, his first since France last summer and his 3rd in a row at Jarama, a circuit he clearly enjoyed. Alan Jones would share the front row, keen to put an end to his bad run of form, with Reutemann 3rd and John Watson a delighted 4th, his best grid slot all year. Prost, suffering neck pain after a testing shunt at Dijon, still managed 5th, and the Alfa drivers were looking a lot more cheerful with 6th and 9th, bracketing Monaco winner Villeneuve, who'd spent much of the weekend in the pits, and even when he was out was having to literally force the car to go round the corners. Pironi, for his part, had had all the technical problems again. Running a higher boost, he kept cooking off his turbo, and he lined up back in 13th. Piquet was 9th, but assuming his Brabham would be back to running 5 kilos underweight for the race, he would presumably move up. The Loti were 10th and 11th, De Angelis, one of only 3 drivers who didn't go faster on Saturday, and back in 17th, 18th and 19th were 3 drivers who really should have been higher. René Arnoux, like Pironi, plagued with turbo trouble, he only managed 4 laps. Hector Ribaque, who probably wasn't benefiting from whatever the team were giving Piquet, and Jean-Pierre Jabouille, still struggling to get to grips with the car after his accident. The March team were delighted as Derek Daly qualified for the first time all year, and his erstwhile teammate Salazar made the grid just in the ensign, bumping Alboreto off by less than a 10th. Gabbiani crashed one of the Azellas on Saturday, so Francia had to hand over his. The team had no money for a spare, and would end the day last of all, but neither of them qualified. There did seem to be some slow progress being made at Tolman too, Henton less than a half second off the back of the grid, while Warwick could only manage a single lap with a split intercooler, but was still quicker than Francia. And so on a hot dry day just north of Madrid, in the presence of King Juan Carlos, but with only 25,000 fans in the stands, the politicking last year and the threat by ETA to plant a bomb at the track probably hadn't helped, everyone got ready to go. Laffite found his clutch slipping as he sat on the grid, the car rolling forward as he waited for Derek Ongaro to hit the lights, and just as he dabbed the brakes to avoid jumping the start, the lights went green and everyone else swarmed past. So as they went into the first corner, it was Jones ahead of Reutemann, while Villeneuve had made a demon start to wriggle his way through the pack to third, with Andretti fourth. Prost had had his front wing trodden on by Villeneuve on his way through, while Pironi had bounced across the dry grass and still made up 3 places, winding up 10th, just ahead of the delayed Laffite. As they went into lap 2, Villeneuve pulled out from behind Reutemann and went past into second place, while further back Tombe had got into it with Mansell and Patrese and peeled in for a new front wing. Prost's own front wing seemed to be holding up though, and he was now 5th ahead of erstwhile teammate John Watson, with Piquet 7th, then Pironi, who was on a charge and had advanced another 2 places, with Giacomelli and Patrese making up the top 10 and Laffite still 11th. Jones was pulling away from Villeneuve, while Reutemann was managing to just about hang on behind the Ferrari, while Andretti was looking over his shoulder at Prost. Further back and off-screen, Laffite had made his way past Patrese and soon overhauled Giacomelli's Alfa too. De Cesaris lasted 10 laps this time before retiring his MP4, and at least didn't take anyone else with him this time, spinning off into the grass all on his own. The youngest driver in the race was starting to get a bit of a reputation for this sort of thing, though, to be fair to the lad, he'd only had 2 collisions in races so far, both of them on narrow street circuits, Long Beach and Monaco. As the cameras watched that and then returned to watching Jones circulate in the lead, Piquet had got past Watson and Laffite past Pironi, so they were now 6th and 8th respectively. There was actually a lively scrap going on between Andretti, Prost and Piquet in 4th, 5th and 6th, but the Spanish director was doggedly focused on watching Jones and occasionally Villeneuve. Chiva rolled into the pits, his clutch pedal having come off, which was going to take a while to repair, and then suddenly Jones was in the catch fencing. We never did see the incident, he'd just locked his brakes and gone straight on. Much gesticulating and a bevy of marshals later, he was pushed back onto the track, now 16th, so Villeneuve was now in the lead, while Jabouille returned to his natural habitat, the pits, to have his rear wheels changed to see if that would help his cause. He arrived in 17th and left 21st of the 23 still running. So, lap 16, and Villeneuve had a lead of about 1.4 seconds over Reutemann, with Prost having got past Andretti up to 3rd and a little over 7 seconds behind the Argentine. Andretti, Piquet and Watson made up the rest of the scoring positions, with Laffite now 7th, Pironi 8th, then De Angelis and Patrese in the top 10, the Arrows having also got past Giacomelli's Alfa. Villeneuve lapped Salazar on lap 18, and was visibly struggling with his handling in some corners, allowing Reutemann to catch up, but the Williams was having problems of its own, with a tendency to pop out of 3rd gear, and Prost was gaining on the pair of them, now just 5 seconds behind. Pironi went off at the same place as De Cesaris, his turbo producing a lively gout of flame but not apparently doing any damage as he bumped back onto the track and headed to the pits in search of a new front wing, emerging at the back of the pack, while Patrese joined him in the pits in his case to retire with a busted engine. The 2 leaders continued in formation, Reutemann either unable or unwilling to make a move, while further back Mansell was moving up, taking 9th off Giacomelli to now be running behind teammate De Angelis, while Villeneuve had a very close call lapping Storr at the Le Mans chicane. Mostly unseen by the cameras, which just captured a cloud of dust, Piquet and Andretti nearly collided and both went off, both rejoining but now behind Watson and Laffite, who were therefore now 4th and 5th, with Piquet having got past Andretti at least and was now 6th. Jones, for his part, had made his way back up to 11th, but his tyres had lost a lot of their speed after his early spurt and then getting coated with dust, and he was finding it rough going. But as Villeneuve had found last time out, you kept running and who knows what could happen. Prost, mostly unseen, had been doing well to slowly close the gap on the leaders, until that damaged front wing betrayed him, and he went off into the catch fencing at Thiega, the same place Pironi, Jones and De Cesaris had all gone off, so clearly a tricky bit of road. So that put John Watson up into 3rd, Laffite 4th, Piquet 5th and De Angelis 6th, the Lotus driver having got past his old team leader Andretti. The cameras caught up with Watson and Laffite as they lapped Serra, while Cheever finally left the pits as they came around next time, 20 laps down and really just going back out to test the fix. Once through the back markers, Laffite was right back on Watson's tail, the two veterans slowly reeling the leaders in, as Villeneuve continued slithering around the corners but having too much power in the straights for Reutemann with his dicky gearbox to make an impression. Before long, the two pairs were in the same camera shot. As the leaders continued to run close together, half-distance came and went, the pair lapping Jabouille, whose Ligier seemed to be running a bit better, at least they had some trouble getting past him, which allowed Watson and Laffite to close up even further. Just a couple of seconds behind them and pushing hard was Piquet, until he pushed too hard at the Monza corner and ended up in the catch fencing, the third race in a row that Nelson had ended the day in the barriers. That promoted Mansell into the points, with Jones now up to 7th. On lap 49, unseen by the cameras, Laffite finally made his way past Watson, but for once it was understandable that the director was sticking with the leader because Villeneuve and Reutemann were still running nose to tail, the Argentine trying to push the Canadian into a mistake or benefit from any problem he might encounter. Jabouille, having made his way up to 13th, now came in to have his brakes bled, another lengthy operation that involved taking the bodywork off and dropped him to last, bar the much-delayed Cheever, but all the while Reutemann continued following Villeneuve like his shadow. Laffite and Watson were gaining all the time on the leading pair, and by lap 59 of the 80 the top three were just 1.2 seconds apart, and not long after that they were right together, the Ferrari, Williams and Ligier almost touching in the slower corners. Reutemann had to go at Peggio when the Ferrari oversteered, but again Villeneuve slammed the door with his greater power, and then, as the cameras watched Villeneuve lap Salazar at the start of lap 62, Laffite pulled out from behind Reutemann and went round the outside into turn 1 to take second. And because Villeneuve was being held up by Salazar, Watson had now rejoined the party, and it was 1, 2, 3 and 4 all running close together and fighting tooth and nail. Salazar impeded each of them in turn, but when Reutemann was balked, Watson took the opportunity to nip past both of the South Americans to take third. But there was no time to watch that because Laffite was really flying at Villeneuve. His power deficit was less than Reutemann's thanks to the big Matra V12 behind him, and his gearbox was working properly, but Villeneuve was driving the widest Ferrari ever seen, and Laffite just couldn't find a way past as Villeneuve threw it around the track. Behind them, Reutemann was likewise harassing Watson, keen to get that third place back, and De Angelis in the 5th place Lotus was now arriving behind them too. It was shaking up to be a really close finish, the top 5 covered by just 1.6 seconds now, with 10 laps to go. The 5 were closing in on Giacomelli's Alfa to lap it, which could prove a decisive factor, but Villeneuve was so focused on defending against Laffite that he wasn't catching him very fast, and the Ligier was dancing around behind the Ferrari. There weren't a lot of overtaking spots at Jarama. One of the main ones was to get a tow round the last corner and pull out on the straight, but Villeneuve had the power to stop Laffite doing that. Reutemann, for his part, found himself having to spend just as much time fighting off De Angelis as he did trying to get third back off Watson, and his gearbox was getting worse too. 7 laps to go. No change in the order, but not through lack of trying on the part of all 5 of them, not least Laffite, as Villeneuve's brakes were now going, and he was locking up and having to brake early in some corners, but still the blue Ligier just couldn't get past the red Ferrari. 2 laps to go, and they were still nose to tail and now approaching Chico Serra, who got out of the way as quickly as he could, as they all went round to begin their penultimate lap. Laffite was running out of time and running out of road. And run out of road he did. After a breathless last 20 laps, the top 5 crossed the finish line just 1.24 seconds apart, first to fifth, which remains the second closest finish in F1 history. 10 years earlier, Peter Gethin, Ronnie Peterson, Francois Sever, Mike Hailwood and Howden Ganley had crossed the line at Monza, separated by just 0.61 seconds. This year's winner, Gilles Villeneuve, moved up to 4th in the standings, just a point behind Piquet and 3 behind Jones, with Jacques Laffite's 3rd podium in a row elevating him to 5th. John Watson scored his first points of the year, and the first points for the carbon fibre MP4 in style with 3rd place, and Reutemann had to settle for 3 points for 4th, and the knowledge that both Jones and Piquet had failed to score, so he left Madrid with his championship lead once more extended. De Angelis and Mansell got some more points on the board for Lotus, who would be hoping that they had turned a corner, the team now 5th in the constructors' standings, and feeling a little more secure financially. Just as in Monaco, Villeneuve had won a race that all the pundits said couldn't possibly be won by that Ferrari, and there was now a run of fast circuits that would be much better suited to the turbo cars: Dijon, Silverstone, Hockenheim, Österreichring, Zandvoort and Monza. Renault had been disappointing once again in Spain, Arnoux forced to use the older car once more and trailing in a distant 8th, and the French firm would be very keen not to be outshone by a resurgent Ferrari on their home track at Dijon next time out.